Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English, and I'm with you now on page 637 and following. We are in unit number 4, the poetry unit. We are in that second collection, as they are calling it, of poetry, and we're going to meet now the great Stanley Kunitz. I'm with you on page 631. Do some quick mathematics of the age and be blown away. I'm with you on 631, bottom of the page. 1905 to 2005 would have been 100 years. He died in 2006. So we are looking at a poet who lived for an entire century. Can you believe it? And think about all the stuff he would have seen if he was born in 1905 and he died in 26. Oh, so for example, think of this. He would have lived with the first walking on the moon and 9/11. Right? He would have been an adult to both of those experiences. Right? He would have gone through all of the major political movements of the 20th century and come out of the 20th century, and during this time writing poetry as well. He is one of America's greatest poets. Let's take a look. Stanley Kunitz was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, published his first book of poems in 1930. Kunitz worked as an editor on many small magazines and taught countless young poets. He was named the United States' Poet Laureate in the year 2000. I've said this before, I will come back to this comment one more time. It is my hope that when you meet a poet and one of these poems, you might be interested or driven to meet the poet again and to maybe have further conversation. This is a poet we'll come back to in our junior year as we study American writers. Let's take a look at his famous The War Against the Trees. We'll read the poem and then we'll come back to ask ourselves what exactly it is that is being said in this poem. Okay? So follow along and we'll do an annotation. Here we go.
The War Against the Trees by Stanley Kunitz. The man who sold his lawn to Standard Oil joked with his neighbors come to watch the show, while the bulldozers, drunk with gasoline, tested the virtue of the soil under the branchy sky by overthrowing first the privet row. Forsythia forays and hydrangea raids were but preliminaries to a war against the great-grandfathers of the town, so freshly lopped and maimed. They struck and struck again, and with each elm a century went down. All day the hireling engines charged the trees, subverting them by hacking underground in grub dominions, where dark summer's mole rampages through his halls, till a northern seizure shook those crowns, forcing the giants to their knees. I saw the ghosts of children at their games, racing beyond their childhood in the shade. And while the green world turned its death-foxed page and a red wagon wheeled, I watched them disappear into the suburbs of their grievous age. Ripped from the craters much too big for hearts, the club roots bared their amputated coils, raw gorgons matted blind, whose pocks and scars cried moon on a corner lot, one witness moment caught in the rearview mirrors of the passing cars.
All right, now let's take a look at this poem. And I can say this out loud. Of the poems we've seen thus far, this is a classic example of a poem that would be pretty difficult to teach in the early middle school years. This poem requires a bit of sophistication. And yet the message of the poem is fairly simple and straightforward. It is, of course, contained right there in the title. The title gives us a lot, so let's start there. The War Against the Trees. The first stanza will give us the context of this poem. Now let's put this in our notes, because great poets love to do this. They love to say things without saying them. Another way to say this is, great poets show, they don't tell. So let's write that down. Great poets show, they don't tell. And yet, when we're finished, we often will recognize that the poet had a clear thesis or agenda. There was something that the poet was wanting to say. In our poem, of course, it's going to have something to do with trees, but let's jump to 2B for a second. Trees in this poem is going to be a symbol of something else. A powerful symbol, we might say. Okay? And of course, we can already begin to ask at 3B, what is your favorite tree? Any student, of course, of 303 knows that our important tree is Ruthie's tree. Ruthie, our school janitor, planted that tree for us many years ago as a way for us to be able to make all kinds of references, and we've made all kinds of references, and we will continue to do so in 303. But what is for you your favorite tree, and why? I've had hunters, for example, who say they know a tree in their memory that was for them a landmark, and it remained a landmark as they got older, and now even today they can go back to that tree. Of course, if a tree is a living thing, then living things die. They either die of their own terms, or they will die because before their time, before their end, somebody decides to jack them. So we're going to take a look at this poem about trees. The first stanza. The man who sold his lawn to Standard Oil joked with his neighbors come to watch the show. While the bulldozers, look at your interesting wording here, drunk with gasoline, tested the virtue of the soil under the branchy sky by overthrowing first the privet row. So let's go ahead and play the game out loud. Because Standard Oil here representing obviously the whole notion of economy, we have a situation where trees now are going to be taken out. They are going to be destroyed. Why? Because of course, we've got to make sure that we get ready to start drilling for oil. Why does anybody care about drilling for oil? Well, obviously Kunitz's unspoken observation is, this is all about money, isn't it? We're going to get rid of these amazing trees because somebody made a business sale, and now we're going to get rid of it. And then we begin to go through the process. Ultimately, though, it all ends with the elms. By the way, notice the great-grandfathers of the town, freshly lopped and maimed. If you want to be a good poet, if you want to be a good writer, everything is about your adjectives and your verbs. Pay attention to the verbs. Notice, lopped and maimed. They struck and struck again. And with each elm, a century went down. Now, of course, for a poet who lived a century, there's all kinds of irony in the line. That with each elm, a century went down. Write in your notes what you think he's saying at level 2A about the fact that with every one of these huge elm trees that was chopped down, it took 100 years for the tree to grow to be that big, that with each one of these trees being torn down, maimed, lopped, bulldozed, a century went down. What kind of century? What are you even talking about? Like, what is going on? Notice the next stanza. All day, the hireling engines charged the trees, subverting them by hacking underground in grub dominions where dark summer's mole rampages through his halls, till a northern seizure shook those crowns, forcing the giants to their knees. Notice all the personification that's going on here at level 2B, right? The trees are personified as these huge, massive, titan-like, god-like figures, and yet they're slowly being taken down to their knees. Anybody that's ever actually witnessed a huge tree being cut down, you know kind of how bizarre it looks. It's got all of the huge foliage, which is slowly kind of dismembered or lopped off. Notice his word is maimed. And then, of course, you start to take off parts of the trunk, and as the tree starts to either be taken off and it's felled, right, or you take it off at the top going down. Either way, notice that when a tree falls, it's like it's going to its knees. And then, the top of 638. I saw, it's the first time that the pronoun I is used in the poem, notice. I saw the ghosts of children at their games, racing beyond their childhood in the shade. Notice, by the way, all the repetitions of the sound A. Racing beyond their childhood in the shade, and while the green world turned its death-foxed page, and a red wagon wheeled, I watched them disappear into the suburbs of their grievous age. I've had students who read this stanza and go, this is some of the most compelling reading that they've read all year long. Look at what he says. Let's break it down in close reading for a second. He says, while all these huge trees are knocked over, taken down, he says, I begin to see the ghosts of children. You're thinking maybe it's at a park or something, right? And he can see, as those trees grew up, all the children who came to play underneath the trees or in the trees. And of course, those children grew up, and the new children came, right? Maybe they even brought their kids to play in the same trees. He says, I watched all of them at their games racing beyond their childhood. In other words, let's put it in our notes. In the same way that children grow up and become adults, the childhood of a culture grows up and matures. And we go from the simple to the technology of the complexity of life. And he says, I began to see what was lost. In the process, trees here become a symbol of all that's natural, all that's right. And then, of course, the aging process of technology, and now we're tearing them down. And again, it's all for money. He says, I watch these ghosts disappear into the suburbs. Nobody wants to live in the natural world anymore. Out to the suburbs of their grievous age. Notice the repetition of the sounds of page and age and shade. Ripped from the craters, much too big for hearts. The club roots bared their amputated coils. Notice all of the violent language of this poem. Write that down. It's right there, of course, in the title, The War Against the Trees. Notice how violent all of his verbs, Kunitz's verbs, are in this poem. The amputated coils. Raw gorgons, matted blind, whose pocks and scars cried, moon. On a corner lot, one witness moment caught in the rearview mirror of the passing cars. In other words, lots and lots of people driving, oh look, they're tearing down all those old trees. Dude, those trees have been here for a really long time. I got someplace I gotta go. Off they drive. Last glance in a review mirror to go, oh, dude, those trees look really wicked weird without their full creation. End of poem. Okay, let's ask at level 2A what's going on in this poem. A couple of things we might write down right away. One, there's a tension in this poem between the natural world and the human world. Of course, the human world here technically is a natural world. But humans have this odd distinction of being really very interested in the world of technology, the world of science, the stuff we make, and of course the stuff we make when it comes into conflict with nature. Who's going to usually win that battle? He says it. Humans have a tendency to use the technology to destroy the very natural thing that is right there in front of them. Number 2, as a possible message here, or theme. The things we lose, we often don't think very much about. We kind of evolve and grow as a species and as a culture, and oftentimes we don't respect the stuff from before, the ghosts of the past. They kind of come, and then they leave, and we move on with our life. Of course, this does beg a really interesting question. Just because we can tear stuff down, should we? And why is it that money trumps, for example, often those things which are natural? And the tearing down of trees then becomes a powerful symbol. Let's jump to 2B. The powerful symbol. What do trees represent in this poem for you? What do those bulldozers represent in this poem for you, or symbolize in this poem for you? And the contest between the two. Right? And why is it the case so regularly that we're so quick to get rid of the things that are beautiful in this world so that we can make some money? At level 3, let's begin to relate this now to ourselves. At 3A, how do you relate this kind of a text to other movies and texts that you know? What is a movie for you that kind of shares this same notion? That we will, for example, and I think there's even a song that says that we will pave a forest to create a parking lot. Right? Think about that. That we see beautiful things like, for example, beautiful mountains, and then we want to put houses on the sides of mountains and condos and that kind of thing, right? Or we're familiar with national forests and parks that easily can be taken away so that drilling can take place and that kind of thing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what is the text for you that seems to kind of speak to that? We might say the greediness, the selfishness sometimes, the economic greediness and selfishness that can lead to all kinds of environmental issues. Okay? And of course, this is a poem about environmental challenges, so let's go ahead and note that. Finally, at 3B, let's ask two questions. The first one is a simple political economic view for you. What are your thoughts about tearing up nature so that we can make money? Pipelines that run through national forests or sacred lands, tearing up trees, and whether it be in the United States or in the Amazon or whatever, deforestation, all those kinds of... Where do you come down on all of that? Do we as a species have the right, do you think, one way or the other? Do you think we have the right to destroy our environment on some level so that we can live and we can habitate and cohabitate? Because inevitably, as more and more people, the planet, we're going to have more places for those people to live. What are your thoughts about that one? The second is a more personal question, and it is about trees. What's your favorite tree and why? If there's one tree that you would say you love more than any other tree, what is that tree? Is it a literal tree? Is it a metaphoric tree? I had a freshman once who said that her favorite tree was the Christmas tree that they had when she was 7. Because they all got in the truck, and they all went to the woods to get it together, and it was a family outing, and they got the tree, and they brought the tree home, and they set it all up, and Mom was a huge part of it, and then later that next year, they lost their mother to a terrible cancer. And that tree became kind of a symbol. What is for you your favorite tree and why? Of course, the idea of trees as being a symbol go way, way back in time. The ancient stories are often stories about trees. Think about the story of the Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Think about Milton's Paradise Lost and the great tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We can go on and on and on with these kinds of references to important trees. Trees represent so much. And of course, they're a powerful symbol, for example, in Native American mythology, because for everything you see above the ground of a tree, there's that much or more under the ground. So trees kind of become a reference point for what a well-lived life looks like. In other words, if you want to be a huge elm tree, you got to take care of those roots, and you got to grow those roots nice and deep. That kind of metaphor works as well. Whitman asks in Song of the Open Road, why is it that sometimes when I walk under a tree, I remember it long afterwards? And he says it's kind of like great people. When you're around great people, you have a tendency to remember them long after the fact. Think of it this way now, finally, at level 3A. This is our last poem in the poetry collection number 2. We had several. We had the all watched over text. We had hope is the thing with feathers, much madness is divine as sense, and now the war against the trees. If we were to ask about all of these and how all of these kind of work together, let's at least say it this way. Each of these poems, in their own way, constitute a certain understanding of perception. The perception from the outside versus the perception from the inside. And the way in which we see the world has a lot to do with the way we understand the world. Is, for example, the world of nature something for us to just be destroyed? Or is it rather something for us to cohabitate with? Because in the end, we also are a part of nature. Well, there you go. An introduction to Stanley Kunitz's classic, The War Against the Trees. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.